How fast can a man lose everything? For Ethan Lancaster, power wasn't just something he had, it was something he wielded. Ruthless in business, untouchable in status, he had spent his life crushing anyone who stood in his way. On this flight, in first class where he belonged, he was just getting comfortable when he noticed her. A woman who, by his standards, shouldn't be here. He made sure she knew it. The comments, the humiliation, the public spectacle. He wanted her to feel small, to remind her, and everyone watching, who ruled the space. But something felt off. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't break. She just waited. And when the time came, she only had to say one sentence, one devastating truth, and Ethan Lancaster's world would come crashing down. By the time the plane landed, he wouldn't just lose the seat next to her. He'd lose everything. How does a man at the top fall so fast? Stay until the end to find out. But before we begin, do you believe in karma? Will Ethan finally pay for his arrogance, or will he find a way out? Drop your predictions in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. If you love stories about justice, shocking twists, and power shifts you never see coming, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this one is personal. Let's begin. Ethan Lancaster strode into the first-class cabin with the effortless confidence of a man who owned everything he touched. The world belonged to him, at least the parts that mattered. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored Brioni suit, exhaling in satisfaction as he took in the polished mahogany panels, the soft hum of conversation, and the knowing nods from other powerful men like himself. This was his domain, a carefully curated world where he never had to share space with the unworthy. That's why he stopped short the moment he saw her. Seat 1B was occupied, not by a hedge fund executive or an oil tycoon, but by a young black woman. She was well dressed. He'd give her that tailored navy suit, pristine white blouse, but she didn't belong here. The way she sat, poised yet relaxed, scrolling through her tablet with an air of quiet focus, made his lip curl. No hesitation, no nervous energy. It was almost as if she believed she belonged in first class. "Not on my flight," Ethan muttered under his breath. He turned to a flight attendant, blonde, mid-20s, eager to please, who was already stepping forward with a trained smile. "Good evening, Mr. Lancaster. Can I assist you with something?" Ethan didn't respond right away. He was waiting for the woman in 1B to look up, to realize her mistake, and move. She didn't. His patience thinned. He gestured toward 1B. "There's been a mistake. This seat is supposed to be empty." The flight attendant's smile faltered slightly. "Let me check, sir." She glanced down at her manifest, then looked back up with a strained expression. "No, Mr. Lancaster. The seating arrangement is correct." Ethan's jaw ticked. "Then move me somewhere else." "I'm afraid first class is at full capacity, sir. There are no available seats." His nostrils flared. "You expect me to sit here?" He said it pointedly, ensuring the woman in 1B heard. Still, she did not react. Something about that, her complete lack of acknowledgement, made his irritation boil into contempt. He wasn't used to being ignored. He leaned in slightly, voice lowering. "Excuse me." At last, she looked up. Her gaze met his, dark, unreadable, unimpressed. She didn't blink. She didn't shift. She simply waited. Ethan smirked. "I wasn't aware they were handing out upgrades so freely these days." The woman tilted her head slightly, considering him. Then, with a calmness that only made his blood pressure rise, she set her tablet aside and replied smoothly, "And I wasn't aware ignorance was still so fashionable." A chuckle came from across the aisle. Ethan's smirk vanished. The flight attendant stiffened, sensing the shift in tension. She opened her mouth, but Ethan cut her off with a sharp glance. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, turning to her instead of the woman beside him. The flight attendant swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, sir. You're Mr. Lancaster." "Exactly," he said. "Do you think it's acceptable for me to endure this inconvenience?" Her hesitation lasted a second too long. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I donate millions to this airline's business class partnerships. Do I need to reconsider that?" The flight attendant's face flushed. I'm sorry, sir. I'll see what I can do." She turned on her heel, walking briskly toward the galley. Ethan leaned back, satisfied. The woman in 1B didn't move a muscle. "You're welcome to switch to economy," she murmured. Ethan's jaw clenched. The audacity. A few rows back, a corporate-looking man in his 40s chuckled. A couple of others smirked in amusement. They weren't laughing at him. They were laughing because they knew who would win. This battle. Ethan exhaled slowly, composing himself. "I'd rather be dragged through broken glass than fly coach. But I suppose some people are accustomed to lower standards." This time, she reacted, just barely. The subtlest tightening of her fingers against the tablet. He smirked, knowing he'd struck something. The flight attendant returned quickly, a strange smile on her face. "Mr. Lancaster, I've spoken to my supervisor, and we're happy to offer you a complimentary bottle of Chateau Margaux as an apology for the inconvenience." Ethan let the words sit for a moment, deliberately making her wait before nodding. "Fine, that will do." He took his seat, but not without a final act of dominance. From his suit pocket, he retrieved his obscenely expensive cologne and sprayed it liberally into the air between them. The scent, a heavy, musky blend, immediately filled the space. He sighed in mock satisfaction. "God, I can't stand certain smells." This time, the woman in 1B pressed her lips together slightly, fingers tightening around her tablet. "Good." The engines roared to life as the plane began taxiing down the runway. Ethan wasn't done. Pulling out his phone, he deliberately dialed number and spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yeah, can you believe this? First-class standards have completely dropped. I'm stuck next to someone who doesn't belong. No exclusivity anymore. It's like they're just letting in anyone." From across the aisle, a man in his late 30s with a sharp jawline and a tailored suit chuckled. "Tough break, man," Ethan smirked, appreciating the support. A woman 2 rows ahead glanced over her shoulder and scoffed, but she didn't say anything. Because at the end of the day, they all knew the truth. This was his world, his rules, and she was just passing through. The plane lifted off into the night sky. Ethan Lancaster had won. For now. Ethan Lancaster clicked his tongue in irritation, standing stiffly in the narrow aisle of first class, refusing to take his seat as his gaze flickered back to the woman in 1B. This was not how things were supposed to go. He had expected to sink into the comfort of first class undisturbed, not be forced to share space with someone who clearly didn't belong. His eyes burned with impatience as he turned sharply to the flight attendant, gesturing toward the woman without even sparing her a glance. "I want a different seat." The flight attendant, Laura, blinked in confusion before quickly regaining her professional demeanor. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lancaster." Ethan exhaled sharply, already irritated that he even had to explain himself. "This seat, 1B, it's supposed to be empty. I paid for a flight without distractions." He made sure his tone was dripping with disdain, ensuring that the woman beside him heard every word. She didn't react. That only made him angrier. Laura's polite smile faltered as she hesitated, then checked the seating manifest again, scanning over the list with pointless effort, as if she wasn't already aware of the answer. "No, sir," she said after a pause, her voice carefully measured. "The manifest is correct. There's been no error." Ethan's fingers curled around the headrest of his seat, his irritation deepening. "Then move me somewhere else," he ordered flatly. "I'm afraid first class is at full capacity," Laura said with an apologetic tilt of her head. "There are no other available seats." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You expect me to sit here?" His voice, dripping with entitlement, was loud enough that a few nearby passengers turned their heads slightly. "Good. Let them hear. Let them understand that this was unacceptable." Still, the woman in 1B didn't react. She kept her eyes on her tablet, scrolling, completely unbothered by the commotion. That irritated him more than anything. He wasn't used to being ignored. People respected him. People feared him. And yet here she was, sitting there as if he were nothing more than background noise. His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, He considered forcing a reaction out of her. But no, not yet. There were other ways to handle this. He turned back to Laura, his expression cold. "You're telling me that a long-time platinum tier passenger, someone who has invested millions into airline partnerships, now have to sit through this entire flight in..." His gaze flicked to the woman beside him before looking back at Laura, lips curling. This situation? Laura hesitated again. She was trapped, and she knew it. Ethan Lancaster wasn't just another passenger. His wealth, influence, and power meant something. One complaint from him, one well-placed phone call to the right executive, and she could lose her job before the plane even landed. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Lancaster," Laura said carefully, hands clasped in front of her. "If there was something I could do, There is something you can do," Ethan interrupted, voice sharp. "Find a solution." The weight of the moment settled over Laura's shoulders, her posture stiffening. Then, after a split second of hesitation, she lowered her gaze. "I'll see what I can do, sir," she murmured before quickly turning on her heel and disappearing toward the galley. "That's better." Ethan inhaled slowly, allowing himself to savor the control. He was a man who dictated outcomes. And if there was one thing he refused to tolerate, it was compromise. But still, 1B remained occupied. His seat remained tainted with an unwanted presence. With a slow, exaggerated exhale, he finally lowered himself into 1A, adjusting the cuffs of his suit as he settled in. Even as he sat, his posture remained rigid, his displeasure deliberately visible to anyone paying attention. He wanted it to be known that this arrangement was beneath him. The moment Laura returned, he turned to her expectantly. "Well," she swallowed. "Unfortunately, sir, I've spoken to my supervisor, and we truly don't have any other available seating in first class." "We deeply apologize for," Ethan laughed, low and cold, shaking his head. "Unbelievable. You people are running a luxury airline, and this is how you handle VIP clientele." Laura flinched slightly, the weight of the situation pressing on her, but she kept her expression neutral. Ethan leaned back in his seat, shaking his head in mock disbelief, then deliberately turned toward the man across the aisle, a sharp-dressed executive type, the kind of man who knew the unspoken rules of the elite. The man smirked knowingly, his amusement barely concealed. He understood. Ethan gave him a pointed look before exhaling through his nose, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Unreal," he muttered, making sure it carried. A few sympathetic chuckles rippled through the cabin, not at him, but with him. A few other businessmen exchanged subtle nods of agreement, as if to say, "You're right. Standards have fallen." It was an unspoken truth among them. First class was meant to be exclusive, not accessible. And yet here they were. Ethan allowed himself a satisfied smirk. The flight might have inconvenienced him, but at least the right people still understood where power belonged. He finally settled back in his seat, taking his time as he loosened his watch slightly. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's just get this flight over with." Beside him, the woman in 1B remained motionless, her fingers gliding effortlessly across her tablet, still ignoring him. That irked him. But that was fine. The game was only just beginning. Ethan Lancaster stretched his legs comfortably, his body settling into the luxury of first class as he exhaled slowly. The flight had only just begun, yet the irritation still buzzed beneath his skin. 1B remained occupied, and no matter how much he made his displeasure known, she hadn't moved, hadn't apologized, hadn't even acknowledged his superiority. That fact alone made his blood simmer. He glanced at her again. She was still focused on her tablet, her expression unreadable. No nervous fidgeting, no avoidance, no discomfort. It was as if she genuinely didn't care. That was unacceptable. Ethan had spent his life commanding spaces, and he wasn't about to let this woman act like she was his equal. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Then, with deliberate ease, he pulled out his phone and dialed. His voice, smooth and cutting, carried effortlessly through the cabin. "Yeah, Bradley. I just boarded," he said, his tone laced with casual arrogance. He paused for effect, then sighed dramatically. "You wouldn't believe the garbage service I'm dealing with right now. First class has gone to hell. They're practically handing out upgrades like raffle tickets at this point. He let the words linger. Made. Sure, the weight of them settled over 1B. Still, she didn't react. His grip on his phone tightened slightly. Fine. Let's push further. He leaned back, voice just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. No, it's ridiculous. I'm looking at it right now. Someone sitting next to me who clearly doesn't belong here. You know how it is. They always talk about raising standards, but in reality, they're lowering them just to fill seats. I swear, next thing you know, they'll be letting people in off the street. A few chuckles rippled through the cabin. The businessman across the aisle, David Miller, the same man who had smirked in agreement earlier, gave a quiet laugh and shook his head knowingly. Another older man in a tailored suit glanced over and smirked, clearly entertained by the conversation. Ethan felt a surge of satisfaction. They understood. They saw what was happening, just like he did. He wasn't alone in this. But then, from 2 rows ahead, a voice cut through the quiet amusement. That's enough. Ethan's head turned slowly, his smirk barely fading as his gaze landed on the speaker. A man in his mid-40s, clean-cut, dressed in a simple yet professional button-down and slacks. He had the look of someone who wasn't used to keeping quiet when he saw something wrong. Ethan tilted his head. Cute. Excuse me. Ethan drawled, his voice edged with mock surprise. You heard me, the man said, voice steady. You're humiliating someone in public, and frankly, it's disgusting. Ethan blinked once, then let out a slow, exaggerated laugh. He turned his attention back to his phone, pretending to ignore the interruption. Can you believe this, Brad? People are so sensitive these days. You can't even have an opinion without someone getting offended. It's not an opinion, the man shot back. It's just being an asshole. A few passengers murmured, some quietly agreeing, others watching with interest. But before Ethan could retort, a flight attendant swiftly approached, cutting into the conversation. It was Laura, the blonde one who had already learned her place earlier. Sir, she said, her voice polite but firm, I'm going to have to ask you to. To what? Ethan cut in, giving her an amused look. To defend this guy for interrupting me? Or are you going to do your job and keep the peace in first class? Laura hesitated. She was clearly conflicted. And that was the moment Ethan knew he had won. She exhaled softly, then turned to the man who had spoken out. Sir, we really don't want any conflicts on the flight. Please, let's just keep everything civil. Ethan's smirk widened. The man looked at Laura, disbelief flickering in his eyes. You're telling me to back off? After he spent the last 20 minutes belittling someone. Laura's face flushed slightly, her discomfort obvious. I understand, sir, but nothing. Ethan cut in smoothly. He turned back to the man and smiled, his expression dripping with victory. See? This is my flight. You should really learn when to stay out of things that don't concern you. The man's jaw tightened, but Laura gave him a subtle shake of the head, a warning. A reminder that pushing further would only get him in trouble. After a beat, he clenched his fists, let out a sharp breath, then sat back down. And just like that, Ethan Lancaster won again. He sighed contentedly, stretching out in his seat before turning back to his phone. Anyway, Bradley, he continued as if nothing had happened. We'll talk more when I land. But seriously, remind me to get in touch with the airline. If this is the direction they're going, I might need to start looking into private jets full-time. He ended the call, slid his phone into his jacket pocket, and took another slow sip of his wine. The flight attendant gave him a tense, forced smile, then quickly disappeared back toward the galley. Ethan chuckled under his breath. He didn't even need to tell her to walk away. She already knew. Across the aisle, David Miller glanced over and smirked. You handled that well, he said approvingly. Ethan gave a lazy shrug. Some people don't understand how the world works. You either command respect or you don't belong here. David nodded. Exactly. Ethan leaned back in his seat, fully satisfied. He had dominated the situation, as always. The flight was back under his control. First class was exactly as it should be. And the woman in 1B? Still silent, still ignoring him. still acting like none of it mattered. For some reason, that bothered him more than it should have. Ethan Lancaster swirled the wine in his glass slowly, watching the deep red liquid move in smooth, deliberate circles as he leaned back, exuding the air of a man completely at ease. The tension from earlier had evaporated, replaced with a smug satisfaction that came from knowing he had, once again, asserted dominance over the situation. The woman in 1B was still there, still silent, still fixated on whatever was on her tablet, and though it should have meant nothing to him, the way she remained utterly unaffected by everything unsettled him in a way he refused to admit. It was infuriating. Every tactic he had used to put her in her place, the comments, the phone call, the humiliation, the passive-aggressive dominance over the flight crew, hadn't worked. She should have shown discomfort. She should have flinched under his scrutiny. But instead, she just sat there, exuding the same unshaken calm she had from the moment he boarded, like his presence was of no consequence to her at all. That couldn't stand. He smirked to himself, adjusting his grip on his wine glass as an idea slithered into his mind, petty but undeniably satisfying. He let the plane's gentle turbulence guide his movement, and with the smallest flick of his wrist, the rich, crimson wine sloshed over the rim of the glass and splattered across her pristine navy skirt. Gasps rippled through the nearest passengers, some turning their heads just in time to witness the moment as the deep stain spread across the expensive fabric. Ethan set his glass down with exaggerated care, then turned toward her, feigning mock concern. "Oops," he murmured, his voice laced with insincerity. "Bit of turbulence. Such a shame." He gave a slow, calculated smirk, tilting his head as his eyes flickered down to the spreading stain on her skirt. Some people never learn how to dress appropriately for first class. The words were sharp, deliberate, a final push to break the silence, to finally pull some kind of reaction from her. The other passengers weren't outright laughing, but there was an undeniable energy in the air, the kind that came when a dominant force reasserted control. A couple of businessmen chuckled quietly, shaking their heads as if to say she should have expected this. Even the flight attendant, Laura, hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but not stepping in. Because that was how the world worked, wasn't it? Men like him dictated the terms. Women like her endured them. Ethan lifted his glass again, taking a leisurely sip, waiting, expecting, to see the crack in her composure, to watch the embarrassment finally set in. But instead, she did something that sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. She smiled. It was small, barely there, but undeniable. Not nervous, not strained, not forced. A slow, deliberate curve of her lips, as if she found something about this moment amusing. Ethan's grip on his glass tightened ever so slightly. She reached for a napkin, dabbing at the stain with infuriating patience, her fingers moving in smooth, controlled motions as if the situation were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. No anger, no embarrassment, no frustration, just complete eerie calm. The flight attendant lingered, torn between duty and the unspoken rule of not interfering with men like Ethan Lancaster. Finally, the woman in 1B spoke, not to Ethan, but to Laura. "Could I trouble you for another napkin?" Her voice was smooth, controlled, void of the flustered emotion Ethan had expected. Laura blinked, snapped out of her hesitation, and nodded quickly. "Oh, of course, ma'am." She rushed off, nearly tripping over herself in her eagerness to comply. Ethan watched, his smirk faltering just slightly, his fingers drumming against the armrest as irritation twisted beneath his skin. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to snap. She was supposed to look humiliated, to shrink under the scrutiny of him and the other first-class passengers who knew the hierarchy of their world. But instead, she just smiled. Ethan's eyes narrowed, studying her more closely. There was something off about this, about her. A sense of restraint, of calculation, as if she were simply waiting. But waiting for what? The thought gnawed at him for a split second before he forced it away, pushing down the odd, inexplicable sensation that something was slipping just beyond his reach. No, this was still his game. He had won. The proof was all around him. The quiet approval of the other passengers, the power he still held over the flight crew, the fact that she hadn't retaliated, hadn't demanded consequences, hadn't fought back. He exhaled slowly, letting his smirk return, brushing off the strange unease that had crept in. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Ethan Lancaster exhaled slowly, watching as the woman in 1B dabbed at the stain on her skirt with an air of infuriating calmness. She had barely reacted to his little accident, had simply asked for a napkin and carried on as if nothing had happened. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Something about her composure dug under his skin like a splinter, a quiet defiance that wasn't loud or confrontational, but undeniable. And that could not stand. He swirled the last of his wine in his glass, letting the silence stretch between them before finally scoffing, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. Then, with a sharp, deliberate motion, he turned his attention to the blonde flight attendant, Laura, the one who had already folded to his will once before. "I don't know what kind of joke airline you people are running here," he said coldly, loud enough to ensure the entire cabin could hear. "But this..." He gestured toward the wine-stained fabric of his seat, as if he were the one who had suffered the real inconvenience. "This is unacceptable." Laura, clearly torn between fear and protocol, hesitated. "Mr. Lancaster, No, don't bother with the excuses," Ethan cut her off, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "I pay for first-class service, not to be subjected to incompetence." He leaned back, expression one of pure entitlement, before delivering the next blow. "I want to speak to your supervisor." Now, there was a beat of hesitation, a flicker of unease in Laura's eyes before she nodded stiffly. I'll get the flight manager for you, sir." She turned quickly, disappearing toward the front of the cabin. Ethan smirked. That's how the world worked, he demanded, and people obeyed. The woman in 1B, however, still didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even look at him. She simply took another napkin and calmly continued blotting at the stain on her skirt. The audacity. His smirk twitched slightly, the simmering irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. He needed to escalate. He sighed, louder this time, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "And people wonder why customer service is dead," he said to no one in particular, but everyone at the same time. "This is what happens when you let just anyone into first class. Standards used to mean something." A chuckle came from across the aisle. Ethan glanced over to see David Miller, the executive-looking man who had been quietly backing him the entire flight, giving a small nod of agreement. "Tell me about it," David muttered. Another businessman nearby smirked. Ethan leaned back, satisfied. He wasn't just right, he was being validated. Laura returned a moment later, this time with a middle-aged man in uniform, his name tag reading Gregory Pierce, flight manager. Ethan barely acknowledged him as he arrived, his focus still on 1B, waiting, daring her to say something, to react. Still nothing. That only made his next word sharper. "Finally," Ethan said, turning his cold gaze to Pierce. "Do you see this?" He gestured dramatically to his seat, as if he were a victim of some great injustice. "This is what your airline considers first-class service. This woman," he jabbed a finger toward 1B without looking at her, "spilled wine all over my seat. And now I'm supposed to just sit in this mess for the rest of the flight." Pierce's polite, trained expression didn't waver, but there was a brief pause before he spoke. "Sir, I understand your frustration. We can provide you with a seat cover, or..." Ethan laughed sharply, shaking his head. No, you don't understand. I don't want a seat cover. I want accountability." His voice dipped lower, his words cutting. "I want to know what you're going to do about this." Pierce's hesitation lasted a fraction of a second too long. That was all Ethan needed. "Let me tell you what you're going to do," Ethan continued, his voice dangerously smooth. "You're going to make a formal incident report. You're going to inform your corporate office that this passenger," another sharp flick of his hand toward 1B, "has caused a disturbance, has been negligent with food and beverages, and has compromised the quality of a first-class experience." Laura visibly tensed. A few passengers glanced at each other, sensing the moment shifting. Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel like a threat. "And then, you're going to compensate me. You're going to make sure that when I step off this plane, my inconvenience is accounted for." He let the words sink in. "Or, I make a call. And the next time this airline is looking for investors, they find out I'm no longer interested." Pierce's neutral expression flickered, just slightly, just enough for Ethan to see it. That was the moment he knew. Pierce wasn't going to fight him. He was going to fold. The flight manager exhaled through his nose, clearly weighing his options, then nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. Let me see what we can arrange for you." Ethan smiled thinly. "That's more like it." Laura remained stiff, her hands clenched together as if biting her tongue, but she said nothing. Because what could she say? The world worked a certain way, and Ethan Lancaster sat comfortably at the top of it. He had won again. Across the aisle, David Miller smirked, nodding in approval. The unspoken agreement was clear. This was how things were done. And the woman in 1B? Still silent, still unbothered, still watching him. Ethan turned his head slightly, letting his smirk stretch as he picked up his fresh glass of wine. He had humiliated her, weaponized the system against her, and reminded everyone in first class exactly who held power here. And yet, why did he still feel like she wasn't the one losing? Ethan Lancaster reclined deeper into his seat, savoring the undeniable satisfaction of victory. Everything had unfolded exactly as it should. He had crushed the insignificant challenge before him, forced a flight crew into submission, and reminded the entire first-class cabin of who held power in their world. The manager had reluctantly agreed to his demands. Laura had lowered her gaze in silent defeat, and the woman in 1B had been thoroughly humiliated, whether she wanted to admit it or not. Yet, as he took another slow sip of his wine, letting the taste roll over his tongue, a faint unease crept into his chest, something he couldn't quite place. He glanced around the cabin, expecting to be met with the usual approval and complicity from his fellow passengers. Instead, something fell off. The atmosphere had shifted. There was a distinct tension in the air, subtle but undeniable. Across the aisle, David Miller, who had been his quiet supporter throughout the flight, wasn't smirking anymore. His expression had tightened, as if he had begun to rethink his association with Ethan. Further down, an elderly couple who had chuckled at his earlier remarks now looked distinctly uncomfortable. A few seats away, a woman who had remained silent until now was now whispering to her seatmate, occasionally casting Ethan sideways glances laced with disapproval. Then he saw it. A phone. No, not one phone. Several. Passengers were recording him. A man in his 30s, dressed in a casual blazer, had his phone propped up just enough to capture Ethan's movements. 2 rows behind him, another passenger held her phone at a low angle, fingers hovering over the screen. Even a teenager sitting beside his father had his phone subtly pointed in Ethan's direction, pretending to scroll, but clearly capturing everything. Ethan's grip on his wine glass tightened, a sharp pulse of irritation running through him. When did this start? His actions had always been met with silent compliance, quiet approval at best, uncomfortable indifference at worst. But this was different. He had seen it before, the way society had begun shifting, how people had started believing they had a right to challenge men like him. He had dismissed it as a passing trend, a meaningless online movement that had no real power in his world. And yet now he could feel it pressing in on him, an invisible force in the air, a turning tide. His jaw clenched, his instincts kicking in. He needed to reassert dominance, needed to remind these people that he was untouchable. His lips parted, a sharp retort ready to spill. But before he could speak, a small, controlled movement from the woman in 1B caught his attention. She had just received something, a napkin. At first, it seemed inconsequential. Laura had returned, handing her a fresh white napkin, an apparent gesture of standard service. But then Ethan noticed the way it was folded. Not just a napkin, something was inside it. The woman in 1B took it without a word, unfolding the crisp fabric just slightly, her eyes flicking downward for a brief moment before she folded it back and placed it neatly on her lap. fingers resting lightly on top. A silent signal. Ethan's pulse ticked faster, a flicker of irritation giving way to something colder, sharper, unfamiliar. What the hell was that? He turned toward Laura, but the flight attendant had already moved away too quickly, as if avoiding his gaze. For the first time since the flight had taken off, Ethan Lancaster had the distinct, unsettling feeling that he had just missed something important. And he didn't like that. One damn bit. Ethan Lancaster sat back in his seat, his fingers gripping the armrest a little tighter than before, though his face remained carefully composed. He had always been in control of spaces, of people, of conversations. And yet, for the first time on this flight, something fell off. The atmosphere had shifted in a way he couldn't quite define, the passive compliance of the passengers giving way to something else, an undercurrent of change that sent an uneasy pulse through his veins. The recording phones, the secret napkin exchange, the way the flight crew seemed suddenly less eager to bend to his will. It was all building toward something, though Ethan couldn't yet see the shape of it. But before he could dwell on the discomfort coiling in his gut, the intercom crackled to life. The voice of the captain rang through the cabin, steady and professional, yet carrying an undeniable weight. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we continue our journey, we'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger on board with us today. Ethan barely reacted at first, his mind still lingering on his earlier frustrations. Probably some insignificant announcement about a charity worker or a loyalty program milestone. Nothing that concerned him. He took a sip of his wine, uninterested. But then, the captain continued. We are honored to have Ms. Evelyn Carter on today's flight, and we at Atlantic Airways would like to express our gratitude for her presence. The name barely registered at first. Then, slowly, his mind caught up. Evelyn Carter, 1B, the woman beside him. The one he had spent the last several hours demeaning, humiliating, and treating like an outsider. And now, the captain was publicly acknowledging her. Ethan's grip on his glass tightened ever so slightly, his expression flickering for a fraction of a second before he quickly covered it with a smirk. He turned toward her, his voice dripping with mock amusement. Oh, I get it now, he murmured, just loud enough for the passengers around them to hear. You're with the airline, huh? Some low-level employee they're giving a little PR moment to? Cute. He chuckled, shaking his head, leaning back into his seat as if the entire situation were nothing but an amusing inconvenience. But what happened next wasn't what he expected, because instead of awkward silence, instead of passengers politely ignoring the announcement, the cabin suddenly erupted into applause. Loud, genuine applause. Hands clapped, voices murmured in agreement, passengers turning toward Evelyn with nods of respect, some even smiling in recognition. It wasn't just a polite gesture, it was reverence. And that's when the first real wave of unease hit Ethan. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about some airline employee getting a hollow corporate acknowledgement. They knew who she was. They respected who she was. And worse, he had no idea why. Ethan Lancaster's smirk lingered on his lips, but something inside him had shifted. The applause around the cabin wasn't stopping. And it wasn't the forced, polite kind that came with meaningless PR stunts. This was different. This was real. He could see it in their faces, the way the other passengers looked at her, the quiet nods of approval, the subtle glances in her direction filled with recognition, not pity. Who the hell was she? He turned slightly, expecting to see some trace of surprise on her face, some hint of embarrassment that she had been exposed as nothing more than an airline darling. Instead, for the first time since he had boarded, the woman in 1B finally turned to face him fully. Their eyes met, and the moment stretched just long enough for Ethan to feel something unfamiliar coil inside his chest, a tension he couldn't immediately name. She didn't look amused. She didn't look smug. She looked patient, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Then, with the same calm, measured tone she had used all flight, she spoke. I, Ethan Lancaster. I am Serena Vaughn, the new CEO of Lancaster Corporation. The words hit him like a hammer to the skull. His smirk vanished instantly. For a long, agonizing beat, His brain refused to process what she had just said. His fingers twitched slightly against the armrest, his mouth opening, then closing, then opening again. A dry chuckle left his lips, forced, hollow, disbelieving. "Excuse me," he scoffed, shaking his head as if trying to dispel some absurd misunderstanding. "That's cute. But I don't," he stopped, because out of the corner of his eye, his phone screen lit up. He had barely noticed the vibration in his pocket amidst the background noise, but now, as if drawn by some instinctive dread, his hand moved on its own, slipping into his jacket, pulling out his phone with a growing, sickening weight in his gut. One notification stood out among the rest. Breaking news. Lancaster Corp announces new CEO amid executive shakeup. His breath caught in his throat. Fingers stiff, clammy. He tapped the notification. The article opening within seconds. And there, in bold, unforgiving letters, was the statement from the board. Effective immediately, Ethan Lancaster has been removed as CEO of Lancaster Corporation. The board of directors has unanimously voted to install Serena Vaughn as the new chief executive officer. Below the headline, a photograph of her. This woman, sitting beside him in 1B, the woman he had spent the entire flight degrading, humiliating, treating like she was beneath him. The phone nearly slipped from his hands. Ethan's chest tightened, a sudden cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck. "No," he muttered under his breath, his fingers swiping frantically, searching for a denial, a correction, an explanation. But every source, Forbes, Business Insider, Wall Street Journal, was reporting the exact same thing. He had been fired, while he was sitting right here, while he had been mocking, insulting, humiliating the woman who had just replaced him. Serena Vaughn simply watched him, her expression calm, unreadable. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Lancaster had no words. Ethan Lancaster's fingers trembled as they swiped frantically across his phone screen, desperation clawing up his throat like a vice. No, 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 this wasn't real. This was a mistake. It had to be. His name was Ethan Lancaster. He didn't lose. He tapped his lawyer's contact, pressing the call button again and again and again, but each time, the screen displayed the same cold, merciless message. No signal. His jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. His heart slammed against his ribs, his pulse a frantic, erratic beat in his ears. He tried refreshing his email. Nothing. He tried opening a browser. Nothing. It was as if, the moment the flight had taken off, his entire world had been severed from him. He was cut off, trapped, helpless. A new sensation crawled up his spine, one he had never felt before. Panic. His breath came shorter, shallower, as the weight of what was happening pressed down on him like a collapsing building. He had to fix this. He had to take back control. His thumb jabbed at his screen again, but the result was the same. No service, no escape. And then from beside him, a quiet chuckle. He froze. Serena Vaughn tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable, not malice, not gloating, but something infinitely worse. Amusement. Still trying to fight it, Ethan? Her voice was soft, almost pitying, but beneath it was a razor-sharp edge that sliced through him like a scalpel. She watched him for a beat, then exhaled lightly, shaking her head. "I don't know why you're so surprised. You didn't actually think they'd let you keep anything, did you?" Ethan's stomach lurched violently, a hollow pit opening beneath his ribcage. His head snapped toward her, his expression twisted in something between disbelief and fury. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice came out harsher than he intended, the sharpness a mask for the fear he refused to acknowledge. Serena leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs with an air of effortless confidence, her fingers tapping lazily against her armrest. "You didn't just lose Lancaster Corp, Ethan." She let the words sink in, her smile widening just slightly, as if she were savoring the moment. Then, with a tilt of her head, she delivered the final blow. "You lost everything. Every asset, every investment, every account in your name. As of right now, Ethan Lancaster, you're broke." The words hit like a bullet to the chest. Ethan's entire body stiffened, his breath caught in his throat, his mind whirling at a speed he couldn't control. No, that wasn't possible. His money, his empire, his power. It was untouchable. There were contracts. There were safeguards. There was. His vision blurred as his shaking hands raced to open his banking app. He tried logging in, his fingers slipping against the screen from the sheer sweat pooling at his palms. The loading bar dragged, the seconds stretching into an eternity. And then account frozen. Balance, $0. A cold, sickening wave crashed over him. His lungs tightened. His vision tunneled. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. This wasn't happening. His fingers clenched around his phone so hard it nearly cracked, his breathing ragged. His mind racing in 1,000 different directions. No money, no power, no escape. His entire existence erased. And Serena Vaughn? She just watched him unravel. Ethan Lancaster sat in absolute silence, his body rigid, his mind refusing to accept the irreversible reality that had just unfolded before him. Everything was gone. Not just Lancaster Corp., not just his CEO title, everything. His assets, his investments, his bank accounts, wiped out in an instant. The empire he had spent years building had been ripped from his grasp. And the worst part? It had happened while he was sitting here, humiliating the very person who had taken his place. The realization settled into his chest like a lead weight, suffocating, inescapable. He was no longer a king, just another fallen tyrant, stripped of his crown. He turned slowly towards Serena Vaughn, his face pale, his fingers still trembling slightly against his phone. She was watching him, calm as ever, her expression unreadable. But there was a certainty in her eyes, a quiet finality that sent a fresh wave of panic crashing through his veins. He opened his mouth, searching for words, for an argument, for anything that could undo this nightmare. But there was nothing left to say. No amount of money, no power, no connections to shield him now. All his life, he had been untouchable, protected by wealth, privilege, and fear. But now, he was nothing. A sudden chime echoed through the cabin. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice came through once more, steady and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. The words felt like a death sentence. Ethan had spent the flight belittling and humiliating others, convinced he was at the top of the world. Now, as the plane began its slow descent, it felt like his entire existence was plummeting alongside it. And then Serena spoke again. "I hope you enjoyed first class, Ethan." Her voice was soft, almost mocking, yet laced with something much colder underneath. "It's the last time you'll ever sit here." Ethan's jaw clenched. His breath was unsteady. He could still feel the eyes of the passengers around him, their quiet judgment no longer hidden. There were no more smirks of approval, no nods of agreement, just a collective, unspoken understanding that they had just witnessed a fall from grace, so absolute that there was no coming back from it. The plane landed with a jolt. As soon as the seatbelt sign switched off, Ethan shot up from his seat, desperate to escape the cabin, to get off this plane and fix what was left of his life. But before he could move, 2 uniformed security officers stepped into the first-class section, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Lancaster," one of them said, voice firm, "please come with us." Ethan froze. His stomach twisted violently as passengers whispered, some stifling smirks, others recording his downfall. He turned sharply towards Serena, his eyes wild with desperation. You planned this," he hissed, voice low, almost pleading. Serena simply smiled. "You planned your own downfall, Ethan," she corrected smoothly. "I just made sure the world finally saw it." Security stepped closer. Ethan had no choice but to follow. He could feel the eyes on him, feel the weight of judgment, of karma, of justice long overdue. The man who had once controlled everything now had nothing left. And as he was escorted off the plane, the doors closing behind him, Serena Vaughn simply picked up her tablet and continued scrolling. For her, this was already over. For Ethan Lancaster, the fall had only just begun. The end. What do you think about this ending? Did Ethan deserve everything that happened to him? Or do you think he still has a chance to rise again? If you were Serena Vaughn, would you have done the same? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story has reached. If you love stories about justice, karma, and the ultimate downfall of the powerful, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.